Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has cancelled a delegation's trip to Washington after the U.S. refused to veto a United Nations Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The Security Council passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, which ends in 2 weeks' time. Netanyahu said he would not send the delegation, including senior Israeli officials, to Washington for talks on a possible alternative to a ground operation by the Israeli military in Rafah, Gaza's southernmost town. Meanwhile, the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says more access points are urgently needed in Gaza to allow aid into the besieged enclave. He'd welcomed the UN Security Council call for a ceasefire in Gaza, but also said that the humanitarian situation in the north remains extremely dire. Jeenah is at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, an expert on the situation there. Naeem, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. I think most of the world saw last night's resolution as significant, in fact really important, and yet Israel continues with its attacks on Gaza. How important is this resolution really?
Well, it's important from two respects. One is that it's important in terms of its moral weight. Finally, the UN Security Council, after 6 months, has taken a resolution that uses the word ceasefire. And secondly, that it's now part of international law. UN resolutions are part of international law. UN Security Council resolutions are. But in terms of its practical effect, clearly there hasn't been anything on the ground in Gaza. The possible only practical effect of it might be a straining of, or further straining of relations between the US and Israel, but not sufficient for the US to do anything about it, it seems.
So then for people in Gaza, I mean, despite the fact that this has happened and that Israel's looking increasingly isolated, I mean, I hate to say this, but it makes almost no difference at all.
No, it makes no difference at all. Netanyahu made that clear even before the resolution was voted upon, and in action immediately after. The resolution makes no difference to him. The ambassador at the UN made that clear in his speech after the vote as well, that all they believe is that all 15 members of the Security Council and the resolution are all shameful, but it has no effect on Israel itself.
Israel's coming under more and more international pressure. I mean, countries like Germany, which have been an ally of Israel for many, many years, now also, joining the call for a ceasefire consistently now. We see this action by the US yesterday. Do people in Israel realize how isolated they are? I mean, I realize that for them, the most important thing is the hostages, what happened on October the 7th, the Hamas attacks. But do they understand what's happening over the long term to Israel?
Well, it seems not. I mean, certainly for the Israeli government, I don't think that they care what happens in the long term. And so in many ways, their actions are, from a diplomatic and political perspective, certainly very suicidal. They don't really care. Their objective is the immediate. For Netanyahu, there's also an immediate personal objective. But for the population, it seems that the focus has become the captives in Gaza, and nothing else matters. And again, in the long term, that's not a very helpful way of looking at your place in the world. There's also the sense, and I think that this is a sense that has been developed over 7 decades, more than almost 8 decades, that Israel is virtually undefeatable. And can act with impunity as it sees fit. That I think that they're going to be losing tarmac on that very, very soon. But at the moment, that seems to be the dominant view within Israel.
I suppose the question next is, if we consider that the US is vitally important to Israel, is it possible for the US at some point to go further, not just to not veto a resolution as they've done here, but actually to withdraw some of the support it gives to Israel?
Very oddly, they're not doing anything more than abstaining from a resolution yesterday. And I say oddly because in the past 48 hours, the U.S. has been, and before that, of course, but in the past 48 hours in particular, the U.S. has been repeatedly insulted by Israeli politicians. Netanyahu himself, then by not sending the delegation, by his other ministers, by the ambassador in the UN, who pointedly said all members of the Security Council have behaved shamefully, etc. And it seems that none of those insults make any difference to the United States. They're determined to continue supporting Israel and supplying them with weapons. I mean, many military analysts have said that if the U.S. stops its military supply immediately, Israel will run out very quickly, because that's where it needs to get its weaponry from. And some countries have already stopped, Canada, for example. But the United States is determined that no matter what Israel does and says to it and about it, it will continue on this path. I think some of it has to do with the elections. Although one might think that Biden would smell the coffee. He is losing support because of his support for Israel right now. But I think he has one eye on the fact that Trump seems to be more pro-Israel than he is, and so he has to beat that. Perhaps that's the issue.
This issue about what would happen if the United States stopped its military aid to Israel, I mean, it's a vitally important question in some ways. From what you understand then, you believe it would actually make a big difference on the ground. I would imagine Israel, as I understand it, has military planners who've been planning for things like this, although, of course, they were caught by surprise by the Hamas attacks. But I would imagine they'll stockpile weapons.
There's only a certain amount that you can stockpile. I mean, I think that the amount of bombing that has taken place over Gaza in the past 6 months, there are no stockpiles left. The supply from the U.S. is on an ongoing basis. And so, you know, the stocks that they have probably last for a few days or a week at a time, because it's coming in all the time. Even if we look, for example, at the Russia-Ukraine war, very quickly the stockpiles from both sides ran out. And there was a whole lot of speculation among analysts about whether they'd be able to pick up with manufacturing more, etc. But countries don't stockpile that much that can, with the scale of the bombing that Israel has been doing, that it can last for more than 6 months. So yes, if the U.S. stops right now, it will make a huge difference. Secondly, that a lot of that military aid, the normal $3.5 billion a year, but then the $14 billion in October, the other $14 billion a few weeks ago, and now possibly another $3 billion. A lot of that goes to American weapons companies, who then supply that weaponry to Israel. If that also stops, then certainly, Israel will not be able to prosecute this war for very much longer.
Jeenah, thank you. At the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection.